Hey guys, welcome back. We are going to take today to play around with our watercolor paint. I know that most of my students took home watercolor paint before we went on our remote learning days, so we're going to play around with that. If you don't have watercolors, you can make shapes and marks with anything else that you have access to, markers, pens, whatever. But this lesson is going to be primarily focusing on watercolor because it's the lesson we left off on, and it's the material that will work the best for these backgrounds. So when I start to make these backgrounds, what I'm going to end up doing is I take a bunch of small pieces of paper. That way I don't become too attached to the ones that don't turn out, because some won't turn out, and that's fine. So I'm going to show you guys how to take watercolor and create some pretty simple background washes. And from there, I'll show you a variety of those, a couple different techniques I've come up with over time. And then from there, we will work on top of them later on tomorrow to finish up this idea. These are give you a little preview of what it is that we'll be doing. But first today, I'm just going to talk simply about some pretty basic watercolor techniques to mess around with some paint. So, like I said, get your watercolors out and let's get started. So now we get to play around with our watercolors a little bit. For this first design I'm creating, I'm limiting my color scheme to about 3 colors. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create these lines. Some of the lines will be more straight, some of them will be curvy, but as you can see, I like to, once in a while, have the colors bleed into each other. So if you have too many colors, this will get kind of muddy. But if you limit your colors to about 3 to 4 colors, it really creates some really interesting overlaps. So you can see I'm starting with the purple, letting it bleed into the blue. This can happen as long as the paint is still wet. So I'm going to do this throughout the page. Sometimes I'll make it so that the colors don't bleed into each other. And then other times I'll try to move the paper around so they bleed even more into each other. This next technique is one of my favorites, and it's because I just really love to view things as a grid, and it's super easy to do. As you can see, my brush is pretty flat, and I'm making this mark, the same mark, throughout the paper, kind of lining them up with each other. Now, just like the last one, sometimes I allow the colors to bleed into each other, and sometimes I make sure that they're very separate. But the grid is just very visually appealing. They make beautiful end results, and they're also really thought-provoking when we start to add some doodles on top of them. We can start to think about ways to connect these shapes, to separate these shapes, maybe add on top of or work in the background, but beautiful grids are really an easy way to use watercolors to make a really beautiful design. So try this on your own. Limit your color scheme. Again, I worked with in 3 colors. I did a dark blue, a yellow ochre, and a pinkish kind of red. And I just started to let them flow. So think about a shape that you'd like to repeat and fill a piece of paper with a grid. So for this next one, I'm going to, you could see I kept my Shape Inspiration Sketchbook page next to me. And I do that because if I ever get stuck, I can just look over at that paper and find an interesting shape. So I'm combining the watercolor approaches that I did with the last 2, but now I'm creating different shapes. Sometimes I'll let those shapes bleed in with each other. Sometimes I'm going to keep them very separate from each other. But it's really a time to just play around, see what looks good. Sometimes these won't turn out, and sometimes they do. But that's why I work on these small pieces of paper, so I don't get too attached to them. So you could see I have this yellow shape that's coming over through the side, and now I'm going to take my brush and do something just like I did with the grid, make some of these little brush strokes. So it's just playing around with your paints and using that shape inspiration to inspire a design. This one is going to be pretty similar, kind of repeating the ideas of the last 3 and combining them together. As you can see, I have 2 separate lines, and I'm going to see how interesting it might be to have them overlap and flow into each other. But instead of filling the whole page with lines, I'm also going to throw in some different kinds of shapes. You can see that I might force these colors to merge together by adding more water or moving the paper around. I really love the way colors bleed into each other, which is why I love working with watercolors so much. And these little abstract backgrounds are really time for us to just have fun and see what works and see what doesn't work.